Imagine a time when 13 colonies, scattered along the eastern seaboard of North America, were ruled by a distant empire. An empire so far away that its decisions often made little sense to the people who lived across the ocean. These people, the American colonists, had little say in how they were governed, and yet they were expected to pay taxes and follow laws set by a king they didn't even know. Eventually, the frustration of being ruled without representation would ignite one of the most important wars in world history, the American Revolutionary War. To understand why the Revolutionary War happened, we need to look at the broader context of the American colonies. The story starts long before the taxes and protests that led to the war, with the origins of the colonies themselves. The first English settlement in America, Jamestown, was founded in 1607, and over the next century and a half, Britain's 13 colonies on the eastern coast of what is now the United States grew, expanded, and developed into thriving communities. Each colony had its own unique characteristics, shaped by geography, resources, and the people who settled there. Some colonies, like Virginia, were heavily based on agriculture, with large plantations growing tobacco, rice, and indigo. Others, like Massachusetts, were more industrial and centered around trade, fishing, and shipbuilding. Yet despite these differences, the colonies shared a common experience. They were far removed from the British government, situated across an entire ocean. At the outset, Britain allowed a fair degree of independence in governing the colonies. Most colonies had their own legislatures that made decisions about local taxes, trade policies, and the day-to-day affairs of the community. The colonies also had their own legal systems and forms of self-government. Though they were technically subject to the British Crown, they were allowed a significant amount of autonomy, which helped foster a sense of independence and self-reliance among colonists. Over time, the colonies grew increasingly accustomed to governing themselves. They developed their own political institutions, such as colonial assemblies, and even began to build their own economies and social systems that were separate from Britain. With a growing population and expanding frontiers, many colonists began to see themselves as a distinct group of people, separate from the British. By the mid-1700s, the relationship between Britain and the colonies was changing, however. For much of the colonial era, Britain had adopted a policy of salutary neglect, meaning that they didn't strictly enforce trade regulations or intervene much in the daily affairs of the colonies. This policy allowed the colonies to flourish and develop their own identities. But in the 1760s, things began to change dramatically. The turning point came in 1756, when Britain found itself embroiled in the French and Indian War, part of the larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. The war was fought in North America between Britain and France, with the Native American tribes often aligning with the French. The war was incredibly costly for Britain. While Britain was able to secure victory, it left the British government deeply in debt. The British Empire had a massive financial burden to bear, and the solution they came up with was to turn to their colonies for help. Britain's government, already financially strained, saw the colonies as a potential source of revenue. The cost of the French and Indian War had not only drained Britain's coffers, but it had also left them with a massive debt. Additionally, Britain needed funds to maintain a standing army in North America to protect the western frontier and prevent future conflicts with Native Americans, many of whom had been allies of the French. The British government, led by Prime Minister George Grenville, decided that the colonies should help pay for the war and for the cost of defending them. However, this approach met with resistance in the colonies. The first step in this effort came with the Sugar Act of 1764, which imposed taxes on sugar and molasses imported into the colonies. The tax was meant to raise revenue, but it also sought to reduce illegal trade with the French Caribbean. It wasn't just the taxes that angered the colonists, but the fact that these taxes were imposed without their consent. They had no representation in the British Parliament, and they resented being taxed by a government in which they had no voice. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed a wide range of paper goods, including newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. The Stamp Act was one of the first direct taxes levied on the colonists, and it struck at the heart of colonial life. It directly affected everyone, from the wealthiest merchants to the poorest farmers. And this time, the British didn't even bother to hide the tax as an indirect measure to regulate trade. It was a clear attempt to raise money directly from the colonies. For the colonists, this was the breaking point. They had long been accustomed to self-governance, and this tax represented an overreach of British authority. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. Colonists believed it was unfair for them to be taxed by a government in which they had no voice. They argued that only their own local assemblies had the right to tax them. The outrage didn't stop with the Stamp Act. In 1767, the British passed the Townshend Acts, which imposed new taxes on everyday items like glass, tea, and paper. These taxes were designed to raise even more revenue for Britain and to assert control over colonial trade. But rather than accepting these new laws, the colonists responded with boycotts and protests. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams, organized resistance. The boycott of British goods became widespread, and many colonists started to see themselves as part of a larger movement against British tyranny. What made the colonies ripe for revolution was not just the taxes, but also a growing sense of identity. Colonists were not just angry about the specific taxes, they were angry because they felt that their rights as Englishmen were being violated. They began to believe that they deserved the same rights and liberties as people living in Britain itself. This sentiment was fueled by a growing intellectual movement based on the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that governments should protect the natural rights of individuals and that any government that violated these rights was illegitimate. By the early 1770s, the colonies were increasingly united in their opposition to British policies. The Boston Massacre of 1770, where British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a confrontation, became a flashpoint. It served to further inflame anti-British sentiment and strengthen the resolve of colonists to resist British rule. Then came the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when colonists, disguised as Native Americans, dumped 342 chests of British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. The British government responded with the Coercive Acts, known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, which closed the port of Boston and severely restricted local self-government. These harsh measures only deepened colonial resentment. The colonies were now on the brink of rebellion. Britain's policies were pushing the colonists further away from the empire, and by 1774, colonial leaders began to gather at the First Continental Congress to coordinate a unified response. The seeds of revolution had been planted, a revolution that would soon be fought not just over taxes, but over the fundamental right to self-determination and liberty. The colonies were ripe for revolution not only because of the immediate financial burdens placed upon them by Britain, but because they had developed a sense of independence and self-governance that made them reluctant to submit to British authority. The colonies had their own economic, political, and social systems, and they began to see themselves as distinct from Britain and worthy of their own nationhood. One of the first acts that truly angered the American colonists was the Stamp Act of 1765. This law, passed by the British Parliament, required colonists to buy a stamp for every piece of paper they used, including newspapers, legal documents, marriage certificates, and even playing cards. Essentially, it imposed a direct tax on the colonists for things they used daily. This wasn't just a tax on luxury goods, it was a tax on everyday items, and it affected nearly every colonist in some way. What made the Stamp Act so egregious in the eyes of the colonists wasn't just the fact that it was a tax. Taxes had been imposed in the past for various reasons, after all. The real issue was that it was a direct tax, meaning the colonists had to pay it whether they wanted to or not. But perhaps even more significant was the fact that the colonists had no say in the law's creation. They had no representatives in Parliament, Britain's lawmaking body, which meant they had no voice in the decisions that directly impacted their lives. This was a radical shift from how the colonies had been governed before. The colonies had always had a measure of self-governance, with local assemblies deciding on taxes, trade regulations, and laws. The British government's actions with the Stamp Act, however, were seen as an overreach into colonial affairs. It was a symbolic and practical violation of the colonists' rights as Englishmen, rights that they believed included the ability to have a voice in any taxation imposed on them. The famous cry that began to spread throughout the colonies was, "No taxation without representation." This slogan summed up the colonists' frustration and sense of injustice. They were being taxed by a government in which they had no representation, and they were furious about it. It wasn't just a matter of money, it was a matter of principle. The colonists believed that, as free citizens of the British Empire, they should have the same rights as those living in Britain itself, which included the right to be taxed only by elected representatives. In response to the Stamp Act, resistance quickly grew. Colonial assemblies began to meet in defiance of the tax, and leaders from different colonies began to organize against it. One of the most important groups to emerge was the Sons of Liberty, a grassroots organization formed to protest British policies. Led by men like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Hancock, the Sons of Liberty organized widespread protests and even threats of violence against stamp agents who tried to enforce the law. In some cities, stamp distributors were hanged in effigy, while in others, stamp offices were destroyed. The protests grew in size and intensity, leading to widespread boycotts of British goods. Merchants in major cities like New York and Boston refused to import British goods, and women in particular became key players in the boycott, organizing groups called Daughters of Liberty to produce homemade goods as substitutes for British imports. The colonial boycott was a powerful tool of resistance, and it had a significant economic impact on Britain, which relied heavily on trade with the colonies. The pressure was mounting on Parliament. Faced with mounting pressure from both the colonists and British merchants who were hurt by the boycott, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. The victory for the colonists was seen as a major triumph, and it reinforced the idea that collective resistance could force Britain to back down. However, while the repeal of the Stamp Act was a win, it was not the end of British attempts to tax the colonies. In fact, it set the stage for even more intense conflict. The Stamp Act may have been repealed, but the British government was not done trying to raise revenue from the colonies. In 1767, Prime Minister Charles Townshend introduced a new set of taxes known as the Townshend Acts, which placed duties on imported goods such as tea, glass, paper, and paint. These were not direct taxes like the Stamp Act, rather they were indirect taxes on goods imported into the colonies, but the colonists still viewed them as a violation of their rights. The Townshend Acts were meant to raise revenue to pay British officials in the colonies, thus making them less dependent on colonial assemblies. These new taxes only added fuel to the fire. For one thing, they were passed at a time when the colonies were already on edge from the Stamp Act crisis, and many colonists saw the Townshend Acts as another step toward stripping them of their autonomy. It felt as though the British government was intent on asserting its authority over the colonies without considering the colonists' concerns. Once again, the colonists resisted. In cities across the colonies, protests erupted, and once again, boycotts were organized. Colonial women played a central role in the boycotts, turning out in large numbers to produce homespun cloth and other goods in place of the British goods that had been taxed. Their efforts were so successful that they became a major symbol of colonial unity and resistance. In addition to the economic protests, there were also increasingly vocal political protests. Colonial newspapers published scathing critiques of British policies, and committees of correspondence were established in nearly every colony to spread news of the protests and coordinate resistance efforts. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams was particularly vocal in organizing resistance, using the Boston Gazette and other local media outlets to galvanize public opinion against British rule. The tensions created by the Townshend Acts, as well as the continued presence of British soldiers in the colonies to enforce British laws, led to further unrest. In 1770, in Boston, the tensions reached a boiling point, when a confrontation between British soldiers and colonists escalated into violence. On March 5, 1770, a crowd of colonists began taunting a group of British soldiers guarding the customs house in Boston, throwing snowballs and other objects at them. The situation quickly escalated, and the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The incident was immediately used as propaganda by colonial leaders like Samuel Adams to rally support for the cause of resistance. Adams and others used the massacre to highlight the brutality of British rule and the danger posed by the presence of British soldiers in the colonies. The British soldiers involved were put on trial, and while 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, the event was widely seen as a tragic example of British oppression. The massacre solidified the growing sense of outrage and distrust toward the British government. Although the Townshend Acts were eventually repealed in 1770, the British retained the tax on tea, a symbol of their ongoing desire to control colonial trade. The colonists, meanwhile, saw these actions as part of a larger pattern of interference in their affairs. The Boston Massacre served as a reminder that the struggle for liberty and self-governance was only just beginning. The resistance to the Townshend Acts and other British measures didn't stop the British government from continuing to push for control. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. The goal of the Tea Act was to help the struggling British company by allowing it to sell surplus tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. While this may have seemed like a simple economic measure, it angered the colonists because it reinforced the idea that Britain was still imposing taxes without representation. The Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, was a direct response to the Tea Act. In an act of defiance, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This dramatic act of rebellion against British authority would become one of the most iconic events in American history. It marked the culmination of years of frustration over British taxation policies and the lack of colonial representation in Parliament. The British response to the Boston Tea Party was swift and harsh. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and allowed British officials to be tried in England for crimes committed in the colonies. These laws were meant to punish the colonists and restore British control, but instead, they united the colonies in opposition to British rule and brought them one step closer to open rebellion. This expanded section offers a deeper dive into the key events and growing tensions that led to the American Revolution, emphasizing the role of specific acts, protests, and resistance movements. It also introduces important figures like Samuel Adams and underscores the escalating conflict between the colonies and Britain over issues of taxation, representation, and governance. By the early 1770s, the situation in the American colonies had reached a boiling point. The colonies were still reeling from the impact of the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the increasingly oppressive British policies. But it was the series of violent and symbolic events in the early 1770s that really began to galvanize the movement for independence and set the stage for the coming revolution. In 1770, the streets of Boston became the backdrop for one of the most infamous incidents in colonial history, the Boston Massacre. The tension between the colonists and the British soldiers stationed in the city had been rising for months. British troops had been sent to Boston to enforce British laws and maintain order, but their presence only fueled the anger and resentment of the colonists. The soldiers were seen as an occupying force, and many colonists resented having to live under military rule. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a crowd of colonists gathered outside the Custom House in Boston to protest the presence of British troops. The crowd began to taunt and throw snowballs at the soldiers, who responded by drawing their weapons. In the chaos, someone in the crowd shouted, "Fire!" and the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 colonists and injuring several others. The victims became martyrs to the cause of colonial resistance, and the incident quickly spread throughout the colonies. The Boston Massacre was a turning point for colonial sentiment. To many colonists, the massacre was a stark reminder of the oppressive and violent nature of British rule. The event was immediately used as powerful propaganda by colonial leaders, such as Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, who depicted the soldiers as bloodthirsty oppressors. Revere's famous engraving of the massacre portrayed the British soldiers firing into a peaceful crowd, further inflaming anti-British sentiments. Colonial newspapers quickly spread news of the incident, and it became a rallying cry for those calling for resistance to British rule. The Boston Massacre served as a symbol of the lengths to which Britain was willing to go to maintain control over the colonies, and it united colonists from different regions in a common cause: the need to resist British tyranny. But the Boston Massacre was only one flashpoint in the growing conflict between Britain and its American colonies. In 1773, another event occurred that would have even more far-reaching consequences: the Boston Tea Party. The British government, desperate to raise money to pay off the debt from the French and Indian War, decided to give the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. The Tea Act of 1773 was passed to help the struggling company by allowing it to sell surplus tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. While the act was technically meant to lower the price of tea, many colonists saw it as a direct assault on their rights and freedom. The British were using the Tea Act as a means of asserting control over colonial trade, and it was perceived as another form of economic manipulation. The colonists' resistance to the Tea Act was swift and widespread. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, merchants refused to allow the tea shipments to land. But in Boston, the protest took a dramatic and symbolic turn. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, including prominent figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, disguised themselves as Native Americans in a deliberate effort to protect their identities. These men, part of the Sons of Liberty, boarded 3 British ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, that were docked in Boston Harbor, and they began to dump the 342 chests of British tea into the harbor. In total, an estimated 92,000 pounds of tea was thrown overboard. The Boston Tea Party was a direct act of defiance against British authority, and it struck at the very heart of British control over the colonies. The image of the colonists destroying the tea, the very symbol of British control, sent a strong message: the colonists would no longer tolerate British interference in their affairs. The event was a rallying cry for resistance, and it galvanized the colonies in their shared desire for independence. The Boston Tea Party infuriated the British government. The destruction of the tea was viewed as an act of rebellion and defiance, and British officials were determined to make an example of Boston. In retaliation, Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts, or Coercive Acts, designed to punish the colonies and restore British control. The Intolerable Acts included several key provisions. The Boston Port Act. This law closed Boston's harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. The port remained closed, effectively crippling Boston's economy and causing widespread hardship for its merchants and workers. The Massachusetts Government Act. This act reduced the power of the colonial legislature in Massachusetts, placing the colony under direct control of the British governor. It also severely restricted town meetings, further limiting colonial self-governance. The Administration of Justice Act. This law allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. Colonists saw this as a way for British officials to escape justice and further undermine local authority. The Quartering Act. This act allowed British soldiers to be housed in colonists' homes if barracks were unavailable. Colonists viewed this as a blatant violation of their rights and an infringement on their privacy. The British government's intention was clear: to punish the colonies for their rebellious actions and to assert British authority. But rather than intimidating the colonists, the Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect. They united the colonies in opposition to what they saw as oppressive measures that violated their rights and freedoms. In response to these acts, colonial leaders convened the First Continental Congress in September 1774 in Philadelphia. representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met to discuss a unified response to the British actions. They decided to call for a boycott of British goods, and they also issued a formal declaration of rights and grievances, which demanded the repeal of the Intolerable Acts and affirmed the colonists' right to govern themselves. The colonies now stood united in their determination to resist British rule. The Intolerable Acts had pushed them to the brink, but they also set in motion the events that would lead to the formation of a new, independent nation. It was clear that the colonies could no longer coexist peacefully with Britain, and that conflict was imminent. The British response to the Boston Tea Party and the subsequent passing of the Intolerable Acts marked a pivotal moment in the history of the colonies. The actions of the British government were seen by many as the final straw in a long series of oppressive measures. The colonies, already frustrated with British interference in their affairs, now felt that their very rights and freedoms were under direct assault. The Intolerable Acts not only punished Massachusetts, but also served to rally the other colonies in defense of their shared rights. The colonies' collective response to the British crackdown would soon escalate from protests and boycotts to open rebellion. The First Continental Congress set the stage for the revolutionary movement, as delegates began to discuss the possibility of armed resistance. In April 1775, just months after the Congress, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, marking the beginning of the conflict that would forever alter the course of history. By this point, the path to rebellion had been laid out, and the colonists were prepared to fight for their freedom. The British had miscalculated the resolve of the American people, and their harsh response to colonial resistance only further fueled the desire for independence. What had begun as a dispute over taxes and trade policies had evolved into a fight for liberty, self-governance, and the right to determine their own destiny. In April 1775, the growing tensions between the American colonies and the British government finally erupted into open conflict. For years, the colonists had been growing increasingly frustrated with British policies, including taxation without representation and the presence of British troops in their towns. These frustrations led to protests, boycotts, and even violent clashes. But in April, the situation reached a breaking point. The British Army, under orders from General Thomas Gage, was sent to the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Their mission was to seize a stockpile of weapons and gunpowder that the colonists had been secretly amassing, and to arrest key rebel leaders, such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were considered dangerous by the Crown. However, the British troops were met with resistance that they likely hadn't anticipated. Local militias, made up of farmers, tradespeople, and everyday citizens, had been preparing for this very moment. Known as Minutemen because they were ready to fight at a minute's notice, these ordinary men had been training and stockpiling weapons in anticipation of British aggression. When the British soldiers arrived in Lexington at dawn on April 19th, they were confronted by a small group of these colonists standing on the village green. A tense standoff followed, and though it is unclear who fired the first shot, it became known as the shot heard round the world. This skirmish marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The fighting quickly spread to Concord, where more Minutemen had gathered, and the British were forced into a chaotic retreat back to Boston under a hail of gunfire from the colonists. By the time the British soldiers reached safety in Boston, the conflict had already begun to spiral into something much larger. Word of the battles at Lexington and Concord spread quickly through the colonies, igniting outrage and a sense of urgency among the colonists. This was no longer just a series of protests. It was now a war for their rights and freedoms. The First Continental Congress, a group of representatives from the colonies, had already met the previous year in 1774 to discuss how to respond to British oppression. During that meeting, they had sent petitions to King George III and organized boycotts of British goods. However, after Lexington and Concord, the Congress shifted its focus. They began to take more decisive actions, including coordinating the establishment of militias, stockpiling weapons, and preparing for the possibility of an all-out war. The events of April 1775 were a turning point. What had started as scattered acts of resistance had now become a full-scale revolution. The colonies, once loosely connected by shared grievances, were now united in their determination to fight for independence. The call to arms had been sounded, and people from all walks of life, farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and even young apprentices, stepped forward to defend their communities and their ideals. While they were far from professional soldiers, these men and women were driven by a deep desire for freedom and self-governance. The Revolutionary War had begun, and the dream of independence was now within their grasp, though it would take years of struggle to achieve. The early stages of the Revolutionary War were chaotic and fraught with uncertainty. The British Army, commanded by General Thomas Gage, was a formidable force. Known for its discipline, advanced weaponry, and well-organized ranks, the British military was widely regarded as one of the most powerful armies in the world. They had decades of experience fighting wars across Europe and the colonies, giving them a significant advantage on paper. In contrast, the colonial forces were an untrained and poorly equipped collection of volunteers. Many were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who had traded their tools for muskets. Yet, despite their lack of formal training, these colonists had something the British lacked: a deep and personal motivation. They were fighting not just for political ideals, but for their homes, their families, and the dream of freedom. As Patriot leader Patrick Henry famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." This unwavering determination became a critical factor in the colony's resistance. One of the first significant tests of this determination came during the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. This battle, which actually took place primarily on Breed's Hill near Boston, was a pivotal early engagement in the war. In response to the growing tensions in the area, colonial forces, under the leadership of men like Colonel William Prescott, fortified the hills overlooking Boston Harbor. The British could not allow this threat to their control of the city to stand, and General Gage ordered a full-scale assault. As British troops marched in formation up the hill, the colonists, who were short on ammunition, were ordered to hold their fire until the enemy was dangerously close. According to legend, Colonel Prescott instructed his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This command emphasized the importance of precision and conserving precious ammunition. When the colonists finally opened fire, the British were met with devastating volleys, forcing them to retreat twice before regrouping for a third successful assault. The colonists were ultimately forced to abandon the hill due to a lack of ammunition, but the cost of the British victory was staggering. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, compared to roughly 450 colonial casualties. The heavy losses shocked the British High Command and made it clear that the war would not be the quick and easy victory they had anticipated. The battle also served as a rallying point for the colonists. It demonstrated that their militias, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, could stand up to the mighty British Army. As one British officer later observed, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. As the war continued to escalate, the need for formal independence became increasingly urgent. By 1776, the colonies were no longer simply seeking fair treatment or representation within the British Empire. They were demanding complete separation. The Second Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial leaders from across the 13 colonies, met in Philadelphia to address the growing crisis. It was during these meetings that one of the most important documents in history was conceived: the Declaration of Independence. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration was a bold and revolutionary statement of the colony's intent to break free from British rule. Jefferson, along with Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, formed the committee tasked with drafting the document. Jefferson's eloquent writing captured the colonists' grievances against King George III and articulated the Enlightenment principles of natural rights and self-governance. The Declaration famously begins with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence, marking a turning point in the war and in history. The signing of the Declaration was a bold act of defiance, as the signatories knew they were committing treason against the British Crown. As Benjamin Franklin Riley remarked, "We must all hang together, or, most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The adoption of the Declaration united the colonies under a shared vision of independence and gave their fight a clear purpose. It also sent a powerful message to the world, laying the foundation for what would become the United States of America. The early stages of the Revolutionary War, marked by battles like Bunker Hill and the creation of the Declaration of Independence, were a time of immense struggle and bravery. The colonists' determination, coupled with their belief in the ideals of liberty and self-governance, would continue to drive them forward in their fight against one of the most powerful empires in the world. The American Revolution was a transformative period in history, filled with remarkable individuals whose actions shaped the course of the war and ultimately led to the creation of the United States. On the American side, one of the most significant figures was George Washington, who emerged as the leader of the Continental Army. Washington, a Virginia plantation owner and veteran of the French and Indian War, was unanimously chosen to command the colonial forces due to his military experience and the respect he commanded among his peers. His leadership was instrumental in keeping the Continental Army together during the war's most challenging moments. Despite facing shortages of supplies, harsh winters, and repeated defeats, Washington's perseverance never wavered. He inspired loyalty among his troops, many of whom endured unimaginable hardships under his command. One of his most notable moments came during the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, where his ability to maintain morale and oversee the training of his army transformed it into a more disciplined and effective fighting force. Washington's strategic brilliance was also evident in key victories, such as the surprise attack on Hessian forces at Trenton after crossing the icy Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776, a moment that reinvigorated the revolutionary cause. Other American figures contributed in equally pivotal ways, though not always on the battlefield. Benjamin Franklin, a renowned inventor, writer, and statesman, used his diplomatic skills to secure critical alliances for the colonies. His charm and wit won the support of France, whose financial and military assistance played a decisive role in the war's outcome. Thomas Jefferson, a young but brilliant thinker, was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, crafting words that would inspire generations. His assertion that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights laid the philosophical foundation for the new nation. John Adams, often overshadowed by others, was a tireless advocate for independence, working behind the scenes to rally support for the revolutionary cause both at home and abroad. Figures like Paul Revere and William Dawes became legendary for their courage and quick thinking. On the night of April 18, 1775, these two men, along with Samuel Prescott, rode through the countryside to warn the colonial militias that British troops were advancing toward Lexington and Concord. Paul Revere's ride has become iconic, immortalized in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, which begins, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." Although Revere was captured during his ride, his warning had already set the wheels of resistance in motion. Meanwhile, Samuel Adams, often called the father of the American Revolution, was a driving force behind the early resistance to British rule. As a master of propaganda and an organizer of groups like the Sons of Liberty, Adams helped spark protests against British policies such as the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, which culminated in the famous Boston Tea Party. On the British side, key figures like King George III and General Charles Cornwallis played central roles in the conflict. King George III, the monarch of Great Britain during the war, became a symbol of colonial grievances. His insistence on maintaining control over the colonies, coupled with his refusal to consider the colonists' demands for representation, deepened the divide and made reconciliation impossible. The Declaration of Independence explicitly listed the king's actions as the basis for the colonies' decision to break away, portraying him as a tyrant. General Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's most capable military leaders, commanded British forces during critical moments of the war. He achieved notable victories, such as the capture of Charleston, South Carolina, in 1780, which was one of the worst defeats for the American forces. However, his campaign in the southern colonies eventually faltered due to fierce resistance from American forces and guerrilla tactics led by figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Cornwallis's ultimate surrender at Yorktown in 1781 marked the end of major combat in the Revolutionary War. Trapped by American forces under Washington and French forces led by General Rochambeau, along with a French naval blockade, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender his army. His defeat effectively sealed the British loss in the war and paved the way for American independence. Together, these figures, famous and lesser-known, American and British, shaped the narrative of the Revolutionary War. Their actions, decisions, and sacrifices left an indelible mark on history, transforming the conflict from a colonial rebellion into a struggle for liberty that would inspire the world. By 1777, the Revolutionary War had reached a critical juncture. The Americans, despite their determination, were struggling to sustain the fight against the powerful British forces. General George Washington faced immense challenges as the Continental Army was often outmanned, outgunned, and plagued by shortages of food, weapons, and proper clothing. Morale among the troops was low, and the harsh realities of war were taking their toll. Desertions were common, and some questioned whether the colonies could truly achieve independence. However, a dramatic turning point came in the fall of 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, a key moment that shifted the trajectory of the war. The Battle of Saratoga, actually a series of battles fought in September and October 1777 near the Hudson River in New York, pitted American forces led by General Horatio Gates and General Benedict Arnold against British troops under General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne had devised an ambitious plan to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies by marching his army south from Canada to Albany, New York, where he expected to meet reinforcements. However, the plan unraveled due to poor coordination and fierce resistance from the Americans. Burgoyne's army became bogged down in the wilderness, harassed by colonial militias who used guerrilla tactics to disrupt supply lines and weaken the British forces. The decisive moment came in October at the Battle of Bemis Heights, part of the Saratoga campaign. Benedict Arnold, who had been sidelined by General Gates due to personal disagreements, defied orders and led a bold and aggressive attack against the British forces. Arnold's leadership and bravery on the battlefield were instrumental in breaking the British lines and forcing Burgoyne to retreat. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 troops to the Americans. This victory at Saratoga was a watershed moment for the Revolutionary War. The significance of Saratoga extended far beyond the battlefield. News of the American triumph reached Europe, and it convinced France, a longtime rival of Britain, that the colonists had a real chance of winning the war. Up until this point, France had been hesitant to fully commit to supporting the American cause, though it had been providing covert aid in the form of supplies and weapons. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. It demonstrated that the Americans could defeat British forces in a major engagement, and it gave the French confidence to formally enter the war as an ally. The French alliance, officially sealed with the Treaty of Alliance in 1778, was a game-changer for the Americans. France provided critical military and financial support that tipped the balance of the war. French supplies, guns, ammunition, and food kept the American forces in the fight, while French troops, led by commanders like the Marquis de Lafayette, bolstered Washington's army. Perhaps most importantly, the French Navy played a pivotal role in challenging British naval supremacy. At the Battle of the Chesapeake in 1781, the French fleet under Admiral Comte de Grasse defeated a British fleet, cutting off reinforcements to British General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown. The alliance with France proved vital to the ultimate victory over Britain. Without French assistance, it is unlikely the colonies could have sustained the war effort or achieved independence. As Washington himself later remarked, the French played a decisive part in the final triumph. The victory at Saratoga not only marked a turning point in the Revolutionary War, but also underscored the power of international alliances and diplomacy in shaping the outcome of historical events. The Revolutionary War, though filled with moments of hope and triumph for the American cause, was a grueling and prolonged conflict. It dragged on for several more years after the pivotal victories at Saratoga and the establishment of the French alliance. Fierce battles erupted across the colonies, particularly in the southern states and the Carolinas, where the British shifted their focus in an attempt to regain momentum. The British strategy was to rally loyalist support in the South, hoping to exploit divisions among the colonists. However, their efforts met with fierce resistance from American forces, who employed unconventional tactics and hit-and-run strategies that wore down British troops. Leaders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla warfare to disrupt British operations in the swamps and forests of South Carolina. Meanwhile, larger battles, such as those at Cowpens in 1781 and Guilford Courthouse, inflicted heavy losses on British forces, even when they claimed technical victories. The Southern Campaign became a war of attrition, with the British struggling to maintain control over conquered territory as American resistance grew stronger. The final, decisive blow to British hopes of victory came at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis, having suffered setbacks in the Carolinas, moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, where he planned to establish a fortified position and wait for reinforcements from the British Navy. However, American and French forces, led by General George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau, saw an opportunity to trap Cornwallis. Washington marched his army south from New York, while the French fleet, under Admiral Comte de Grasse, sailed to block the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis from reinforcements and supplies. The siege began in September 1781 and lasted for weeks, with American and French forces bombarding the British fortifications relentlessly. Cornwallis's troops, outnumbered and surrounded, attempted to hold out, but their situation became increasingly desperate. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis was forced to surrender his army of over 7,000 soldiers. The victory at Yorktown was a momentous occasion, and news of the surrender spread quickly, sparking celebrations throughout the colonies. As the British band played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," Cornwallis's defeat marked the end of major military operations in the war. The surrender at Yorktown was the final straw for the British government. After 6 years of costly conflict, it became clear that the war was unwinnable. Public opinion in Britain had turned against the war, and Parliament began calling for peace. Negotiations between American and British representatives began in Paris, with Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams leading the American delegation. The result of these talks was the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783. The Treaty of Paris officially recognized the independence of the United States and established its borders, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from Canada to Florida. It also granted Americans fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland and required both sides to honor debts and restore confiscated property. For the colonies, it was a monumental moment. The hard-fought struggle for independence had been won, and the United States of America was now a sovereign nation. The surrender at Yorktown and the subsequent signing of the Treaty of Paris marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The ideals of liberty, self-governance, and perseverance had triumphed against the odds, setting the stage for the development of a nation that would go on to shape the course of history. The American Revolution was not just a pivotal event in the history of the United States. Its impact reverberated far beyond the newly independent nation's borders. The ideals of liberty, equality, and self-governance championed during the Revolution inspired other countries and movements around the world. In particular, the Revolution influenced the French Revolution, which began in 1789. French citizens, many of whom had witnessed or supported the American fight for independence, were emboldened to challenge their own monarchy and demand greater rights. The Declaration of Independence, and its assertion that all men are created equal, served as a powerful symbol for those seeking to overthrow oppressive regimes. Similarly, the American Revolution influenced independence movements in Latin America and even anti-colonial struggles in Asia and Africa centuries later. For the United States, the Revolution marked the birth of a new nation, one founded on the principles of democracy and self-rule. While the specifics of the American government would take years to finalize, the Revolution established a foundation for a political system that would serve as a model for others. The United States became a beacon of hope for those who believed in the possibility of building a society where power rested with the people rather than a monarchy or ruling elite. As George Washington wrote in 1783, the Revolution had secured the blessings of liberty for future generations, a sentiment that captured the optimism and ambition of the time. However, the Revolution also left behind a host of challenges that the young nation had to overcome. The war had taken a severe toll on the economy. Trade had been disrupted, debts had mounted, and inflation was rampant. The fledgling government under the Articles of Confederation struggled to address these economic woes, as it lacked the power to levy taxes or regulate commerce effectively. The post-war period also saw tensions between different groups within the population. While many celebrated independence, others remained loyal to Britain, and divisions between regions, classes, and racial groups persisted. One of the most pressing challenges was uniting the states into a cohesive nation. Each state had its own interests, laws, and priorities, and there was little consensus on how much power should be given to a central government. This lack of unity became apparent during events like Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787, when economic grievances among farmers in Massachusetts boiled over into armed protest. Such incidents highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and underscored the need for a stronger national government. In response to these challenges, leaders convened the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where they debated and ultimately created the United States Constitution. The Constitution was designed to address many of the issues left unresolved by the Articles of Confederation, establishing a federal government with the power to tax, regulate trade, and provide for the common defense. It also created a system of checks and balances to ensure no single branch of government could dominate, reflecting the lessons learned from the Revolution about the dangers of concentrated power. Yet, even with the adoption of the Constitution, the legacy of the Revolution was not without its struggles. Questions about who was truly included in the new vision of liberty and equality lingered. Enslaved people, women, and indigenous populations were largely excluded from the rights and freedoms promised by the Revolution. These contradictions would remain a source of tension in American society, fueling debates and movements for change in the years to come. The American Revolution was a moment of profound transformation, laying the groundwork for a nation built on democratic principles while inspiring others to fight for their own freedom. But it was also the beginning of a long journey. The challenges of uniting diverse states, addressing economic instability, and living up to the ideals of liberty and justice for all would shape the story of the United States for generations. As the country navigated its new identity, the Revolution's promise of a better future remained a guiding light, even amid the difficulties of turning that vision into reality. The American Revolutionary War was more than just a war for independence. It was a war for freedom, equality, and self-governance. The ideas that were born in the struggle for independence would go on to shape the future of the United States and inspire movements around the world. The fight for liberty wasn't easy, but the victory of the American Revolution would forever change the course of history.